The myth of education as the great equalizer, why hard work alone will never close the gap. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for what I believe will be a conversation that challenges some of our most deeply held beliefs about success, opportunity, and equity in America. I recently had the extraordinary privilege of interviewing Jocelyn Branch, a formidable advocate and visionary whose work has fundamentally transformed how we understand the intersection of race, gender, and economic opportunity. Jocelyn isn't just a researcher or speaker. She's a truth teller whose unflinching analysis has forced institutions across the country to confront their complicity in systems of inequity. Her groundbreaking work has created pathways for policy change that many thought impossible, and her voice has become a beacon for those fighting for economic justice in America. What struck me most about my conversation with Jocelyn was her ability to articulate an uncomfortable truth that many of us have been reluctant to confront. We've long embraced the comforting narrative that education is the great equalizer in our society. Work hard, get those degrees, climb the ladder of credentials, and surely the playing field levels out. It's a beautiful story, a reassuring story. But as Jocelyn Branch powerfully demonstrated, it's a dangerous myth. The data tells us something far more troubling. Even at the highest levels of education and leadership, Black women continue to face significant wage gaps and systemic barriers. This isn't just happening in entry level positions where we might expect disparities to be most pronounced. It's happening at every rung of the professional ladder, including executive positions where Black women have already proven themselves by conventional standards. Let that sink in for a moment. Black women with advanced degrees still earn as little as 59% of what white men make with comparable credentials. 59%. This fundamentally challenges the narrative that simply working twice as hard or accumulating more impressive credentials will close these gaps. The reality Jocelyn helped illuminate is that these disparities reflect something much deeper: how profoundly racism and sexism remain entrenched within our economic systems. This isn't just about individual choices or effort. It's about systems that were designed with built in inequities that persist regardless of individual achievement. During our conversation, Jocelyn emphasized three critical insights that I believe we all need to carry forward. First, the wage gap for Black women persists across all education levels: bachelor's, master's, professional degrees. None provide immunity from this disparity. Second, systemic discrimination, not just individual effort, drives these disparities, meaning policy change and collective action are essential for real progress. And third, true empowerment comes from both personal resilience and community advocacy. To understand the scope of this challenge, let me share some of the powerful examples Jocelyn discussed during our interview. In Washington, D.C., a 2025 Institute for Women's Policy Research report revealed that Black women working full time year round, despite holding advanced degrees, earned $59,000 less than white men annually. Think about that number: $59,000. That's not a small discrepancy. That's the equivalent of an entire additional salary for many Americans. That's a home down payment every single year. That's college tuition for a child. That's the difference between financial security and constant vulnerability. These women weren't lacking qualifications. They weren't missing credentials. They had done everything society told them would ensure fair treatment. Yet, the gap persisted. But here's where the story takes an important turn. Local organizations responded by launching advocacy campaigns pushing for transparent pay reporting laws and equity audits within major employers. Black professional networks, tired of seeing the data without action, organized and demanded change. The outcome? Several DC based firms adopted salary transparency policies, and the City Council passed measures requiring annual pay equity reports from large employers. This wasn't spontaneous corporate goodwill. It was the direct result of years of grassroots organizing, of Black women saying, "We will no longer accept being undervalued and underpaid." This demonstrated something crucial that Jocelyn emphasized. When community advocacy meets policy reform, real change becomes possible. It set a precedent for other U.S. cities seeking actionable solutions on closing gendered racial wage gaps. But representation alone isn't enough, as another powerful example from Georgia illustrates. In Georgia's state government workforce, Black women comprise 27%, the highest representation regionally. Yet they still encounter stagnant wages compared to their peers. This overrepresentation in public sector roles without corresponding compensation parity created what Jocelyn called the illusion of progress. Visible diversity masking continued economic inequity. State employee unions collaborated with advocacy groups demanding fair pay adjustments tied explicitly to cost of living increases. Georgia eventually enacted targeted salary increases for underpaid workers after audit findings highlighted inequities faced by its majority minority workforce segment. What's particularly revealing about this situation is that the decades long concentration of Black women in government jobs was initially viewed as stability and progress, but masked deeper issues around undervaluation, even where representation was strong. This highlights the critical distinction between representation, being present, versus true economic empowerment, being paid fairly. The impact of these economic disparities extends far beyond individual workplaces. As Jocelyn shared, a spring 2025 poll found that 88% of Black women voters feel dissatisfied with America's direction and cite declining economic conditions as a primary reason. They face rising costs outpacing wages, fears over basic needs like healthcare access and quality education, while feeling excluded from decision making processes impacting their lives directly in response. We've seen grassroots mobilization led by civic groups centered around solutions designed by us, including town halls amplifying lived experiences and policy proposals demanding investment into communities most affected. This has resulted in increased political engagement and new coalitions formed between business leaders and activists advocating not just for workplace reforms, but for holistic community investments. Years spent being sidelined catalyzed a shift towards collective action rather than waiting on top down fixes, reflecting historic patterns where progress was made only when driven internally within affected communities. The broader recognition nationally is that sustainable solutions must include direct participation and leadership from those most impacted. What Jocelyn Branch's insights reveal is that we're witnessing a profound shift in how we understand both the problem and the solutions. The myth of individual achievement as the primary path to equity is giving way to a more nuanced understanding that recognizes the power of collective action and systemic change. This matters deeply for all of us Many Black women have spent years in survival mode, leading teams, raising families, holding down households, carrying communities while operating under the assumption that if they just work hard enough, if they just get enough credentials, if they just prove themselves repeatedly, the system will eventually recognize their worth. But what if that assumption itself is part of what keeps us trapped in cycles of overextension and undervaluation? What if our path forward isn't about working harder within broken systems, but about collectively transforming those systems? When we refuse to participate in systems that demand superhuman effort while providing subequitable compensation, we're not just protecting our own peace, we're creating space for systemic change. Learning to say no without guilt takes on new meaning in this context. It's not just about personal boundaries, it's about refusing to accept the unacceptable. As Jocelyn emphasized, empowerment comes from both personal resilience and community advocacy. While standing firmly in your truth can be healing on an individual level, broader change requires us to demand accountability from institutions making decisions about us without us. So I ask you today, what would our world look like if we stop perpetuating the myth that education alone will save us? What if instead of telling our daughters to work twice as hard, we built systems where they could work equally and be valued fully? What if instead of accepting that a Black woman with a master's degree will earn 59 cents for every dollar her white male counterpart makes, we recognize this as the profound moral failure that it is? The time for polite acceptance is over. The data is clear. The harm is documented. The path forward requires both personal resilience and collective action. It requires us to heal ourselves while simultaneously working to heal broken systems. I challenge each of you today to examine where you hold power in your workplace, in your community, in your sphere of influence, and ask yourself, am I perpetuating the myth of meritocracy while ignoring systemic barriers? Am I demanding individual excellence from marginalized groups without demanding systemic accountability from institutions? Change begins when we stop accepting comfortable myths and start confronting uncomfortable truths. It continues when we move from awareness to action, from individual achievement to collective liberation. Education alone will never be the great equalizer as long as racism and sexism remain embedded in our economic systems. But together, through collective action, policy change, and unwavering demands for justice, we can build something far more powerful than an equalizer. We can build a new system altogether. Thank you.